Hi friends, it's Lee Scoggins from the Absolute Sound. I wanted to tell you today about a very interesting trip that I had to Hayward, California, where the Magico factory is. I say interesting because it sort of rearranged what I thought was possible from audio. And of course, I was out there at a lone wolf's invitation to hear the Magico M9s. It is a speaker that really sort of rearranged what I thought was possible from high-end audio because it created such a lifelike presence of musicians playing in a real space. Now these are $750,000 loudspeakers, so it should be pretty special. And we were listening in I guess $1 million or so room within a room, perfect acoustics listening room that Alon has sort of in the center of the factory in the front part of the building. And that certainly helped. But if you're going to have a system like this, you'd probably have a pretty good acoustic room and space to play it in. But nonetheless, what I learned on this trip was very interesting. In fact, it made me think about some thoughts that I'd had over the last few years where I was kind of thinking about my experiences going around the country and going over to Europe as well. You know, I went to the Audio Group Denmark facility in Aalborg, Denmark, and I started to get a lot of experience with the more expensive sort of flagship reference systems, if you will. And one of the things that I've discovered is that the law of diminishing returns doesn't actually apply in high-end audio. Now, you could say technically it does, but in terms of actually what the meaning of that law is and what people say about that law in terms of you reach a point of diminishing returns and you should sort of stop there, or they imply you should stop there, it doesn't actually really happen that way. In fact, in my experience, now that I've heard these really expensive systems, most of which I can't afford, it actually just keeps going. So let me explain this using a piece of paper.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Martin, executive publisher of The Absolute Sound and a reviewer here on the TAS YouTube channel. I'd like to make you aware of an offer to get our weekly newsletter simply by providing your email address through the link that's on screen right now, or there's a link in the show notes below. Twice a week, we will send you written audio reviews, music reviews, news of new audio gear, and our 3 times a year Editor's Choice, Product of the Year, and Golden Ear Awards so that you can find the best audio equipment that's currently on the market. It's easy to sign up, and we hope you'll join us. Now back to the show.
Okay, so first of all, let's actually define, using the Oxford Dictionary, what is the law of diminishing returns? And the law of diminishing returns essentially states, and I quote, benefits gained from something will represent a proportionally smaller gain as more dollars or energy is invested in it. So if you want to think about this, you can sort of graph this out as an asymptotic line. So if you can see this well, you'll see that we have on the y-axis sound quality, and then on the x-axis we have the amount of dollars put into it. Now most people assume that at some point in the future, when you get to the nether reaches of spending money on high-end audio, and some people feel this number is actually low, like 5 or 10 or 20,000, any more dollars invested in speakers or electronics or sources is just going to create an incremental return situation. And so what you have here on the theory part of this is that it sort of becomes an asymptotic line, and somewhere around here, you're actually looking at maximizing, if you will, your sound utility per dollar. But in fact, in actuality, in my opinion, I know this is a bold statement to make, but if you get experience listening to the very high quality reference systems, the actual thing is that the line, it may slope a little bit differently, but it just keeps going. In other words, what I'm suggesting today to you is that the law of diminishing returns doesn't actually, in fact, exist for high-end audio. And I will explain that because I know that's a bold statement, and we read a lot on audio fora, we've read a lot in magazines and articles, but I would argue from less experienced people that the law of diminishing returns kicks in. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to spend a huge amount of money. We're always trying to be, there's so much great affordable audio now. We really are living in a golden age of affordable products. So do stop where it doesn't make any sense for your personal financial situation. But I think if we're going to talk about laws as a universal truth, like I think this law of diminishing returns is represented online in most places, we need to examine it and see what that actually comes down to. So I know this is a bold statement, so I need to support this statement with an argument and break down why I think this law of diminishing returns no longer exists. And then we'll talk about the technology at the factory of Magico and my listening experience and impressions from the Magico M9s right after this, because I want to give you context of why I changed my mind, and I want to try and convince you or persuade you, or at least put an argument in front of you that the law of diminishing returns is maybe a bit of misinformation, which is an overused term, information for audiophiles. And I want you to think about the counter argument at the very least. And I would like, if you disagree with me, or you agree with me, or you agree with me with some caveats, to put that in the comments below the video. I think this is something we need to have, a national conversation about. But let me start off and start with the biggest one. The number one reason that the law of diminishing returns doesn't apply to audio is, in fact, this y-axis. How do you measure that? Well, what is the right metric for sound quality? Is it the less noise? And how do you measure noise? Is it the lowest distortion overall? Is it the lowest THD? We've seen where that's gotten us in trouble in the past. What we've discovered, though, in audio, and our editor Robert Harley has written about this, we have discovered that, in fact, our hearing is not linear. As you get incremental improvements in technical measures, the amount of realism that we hear and the way that our brains process that information is actually a step function. It actually gets better and better and better. So it doesn't mean that the linearity of a metric, if you will, let's just say it's distortions. Just imagine your favorite distortion number. Let's just say it's total harmonic distortion. As that gets incrementally lower, that doesn't mean that we're going to hear incremental benefits in terms of the overall experience of listening to that music. In fact, as it turns out, we get much greater satisfaction, we get much closer to the music, there's much more lifelikeness, there's more presence in the music, and we forget about the equipment and we just fade into listening to the music, the musician's performance, and the overall emotion that we get from hearing that great piece of music and that great performance. Hopefully it's great. Particularly if it's well recorded, obviously, as well. But all else being equal, those incremental improvements are not linear incremental improvements in terms of our overall satisfaction and if you will, our pulling into that musical event and becoming part of the soundstage. So that's number one. The metrics are misleading because we do not process information in a linear fashion. So incremental metric measurement does not equal incremental satisfaction as an audio experience. Number two, I think it's safe to say, is scale. Once you have a magnificent speaker like a Magico M9 that are giant towers, and you're in the appropriate listening room, admittedly a loan's probably put in I don't know how much, $1 million, whatever it costs to build that listening room out. It was a substantial investment for sure. You could tell from visiting the room and hearing alone talk about all the considerations that went into building that. That scale, in fact, actually creates, and I would say the number of drivers in the Magico M9 creates that giant image, that lifelike, they're real performers of real height, and not small height, it's not a small image, but they're not only in the room, but with the M9s, as we'll talk about later, the speakers disappear, and you're presented with musicians on a soundstage. That amount of realism is driven by a tower speaker with extra drivers. And in order to get that experience, you have to spend money because there are more drivers, and you have to have a inert cabinet, which also costs more money. We'll talk about that soon and show some photos or video. And so scale is the other reason why there are no diminishing returns. In fact, as you add drivers, provided that you do the crossover right and provided you've optimized other things, you do get closer to a lifelike experience. You're hearing acoustic instruments with the correct timbre, and it sounds like what you heard when you went to the concert the other day at the acoustic event at a church or your favorite music venue or a small jazz club. The third thing that I want to point out about the law of diminishing returns, which I think is problematic in terms of proving the way this law operates, is I have been on a lot of audio fora, for better or worse, some days worse, sometimes better, because it's a great way to share information, but there's a lot of BS out there, if you'll pardon the expression. And a lot of folks will actually ask about equipment recommendations, and there'll be a lot of discussions of when the law of diminishing returns kicks in. But the problem with that is that it's often used as a crutch to dissuade people from purchasing better quality gear, even in cases where they can comfortably afford it, and it probably would be a good move to get the better turntable, or the better cartridge, or the better D to A converter, or improve the speakers, or go to a slightly higher quality amplifier and preamplifier, or a higher quality integrated, depending on what your space requirements and realities are. So I worry that because this law is so often talked about, that's going to persuade people from doing what I think might be an actual prudent thing, where they make an investment that's going to have a high return on sound quality, even though it's buying maybe another level up or another half level up. We should be very cautious not to put too many guardrails and limits on what's possible in high-end audio, particularly as we gain experience moving up the line in higher and higher quality. I'll give you an example that's relevant in my world. I remain a big fan of Benchmark. Benchmark makes really high-quality, affordable DACs, and the more recent ones they're doing are supremely musical, in addition to sort of being highly resolving and having all those great technical measurements that you want to have in a DAC as well. But they're very musical D to A converters. My first one was a Benchmark DAC 1. I think I bought it used for $400. Then I shelled out about $2,000 and I got a Benchmark DAC 2. It was tons better. The chips kept getting better. The implementation got better. John Sayal, their engineer, did a better and better job. But at some point I had made some money. I wanted to do something really nice. And I found this guy, Ted Smith, who works with PS Audio, and he had used FPGA componentry, and an FPGA to build a $6,000 at the time PS Audio Direct Stream DAC. I think there's a new one now out that's around $8,000. But that DAC was substantially better in a lot of ways than my Benchmark. Some ways it wasn't, but in other areas it was substantially better. I was getting a deeper and a wider soundstage. But fortunately, about a year ago, I was able to scrounge up a lot of money and buy a Rossini Apex DAC and use that as both my streaming device and coupled with a transport later and a master clock, essentially my digital stack, if you will. And I've got to tell you, and I'm doing a separate review that's almost done on this, that Apex DAC showed me how good and how musical digital can be. Digital always had a little bit of an edge to my ears. It always wasn't quite what my turntable could do, even though I have a relatively humble VPI Scoutmaster, which is still a great table for the money. But as I got experience on the Apex, the soundstage extended well beyond the sides of the speakers. It was deeper than the back wall of my listening room by, say, 6 feet, or at least that was the illusion that I'm hearing, if you will. And that was substantially better. So we went from a $2,000 DAC in the Benchmark DAC 2 to a $6,000 Direct Stream PS Audio to, and I'm still amazed that I've spent this money, to a Rossini Apex DAC that I think now retails around $38,000, which is a crazy amount of money. So, I recognize this, but because I'm in the audio reviewing business, this was something that I get tremendous joy and utility out of, so I went for it, if you will. But let me tell you, there's no diminishing returns in D/A converters. That $2,000 DAC doesn't, it's blown away by the direct stream, and the direct stream is blown away by the DCS Rossini Apex. I'm sorry it is that way. I think they're all great DACs. I think you can be happy at any of those levels. But if you're really trying to get the ultimate playback, the Rossini is a way to go. And I think this is what we're seeing with loudspeakers. And that brings us back to Magico. The M3 is an amazing speaker. I have a friend that just ordered one. For that matter, the A5 is an amazing speaker. I have a very good friend from college who uses it in his main system. And those are amazing speakers. But it's not an incremental improvement to go from an M3 to an M6. The M6 is a lot better. And then to go from an M6 to an M9. The M9 is a boatload better. It's just amazing what that M9 can do. So let's talk about Magico, and let's talk about why my experience with the M9 was not only just a fun sound experience, like, wow, this is truly state-of-the-art. I never thought that I could hear a system sound this good, to, you know what, this actually culminates a lot of thinking I've had about how the law of diminishing returns is a lot of hooey. So let's go back in time. Let's go back a couple months ago when I was at the Magico factory. And I think what Alon has done, he's got a technology guy named Yair, and Yair's a brilliant guy. The two of them together are kind of a brilliant design team. And it's hard for me to tell where Alon begins and Yair comes in, but they've both created some very special products. And what I think it boils down to, at least from what I saw at the factory, were three things. One, they use the finest quality parts. If you look at the crossovers, everything, they're always testing, they're always trying to get better. There was a demonstration of how strong the magnets are in the basket of the drivers. Everything is always a push for greatness in terms of parts quality. And on something like the M9, there's obviously no limit in terms of what they can do. The second thing that I thought was interesting was the degree of precision and inertness in the cabin and the lengths that Alon has gone to minimize vibration and noise. If you look at the cabinets under construction for the M9, there was a bunch stacked up, and it was really amazing to look at them, because I've seen carbon fiber designs before. I've seen stuff in the exotic car community or the racing community, the track community, the hoods, the Weissach Porsches, all that. But this was another level. This was something where the interior structure of carbon fiber was blended with metal, aluminum componentry to kind of create something really special. And it's mostly carbon fiber, I think it's safe to say, in the M9. Alon may correct me here in the comments, but you wind up with a cabinet that just doesn't vibrate. And they're serious about this. They've got a laser vibrometer and they shoot the side of the cabinet, and there's very little flexing going on. There's very little vibration, and they're always drilling that down. I think the third secret ingredient and why the M9 is sort of a game changer for me, to kind of use Robert Hartley's words, I guess that's a fair statement, is the drivers are really special. They have special coatings, they have carbon fiber skins, but they have a very intricate aluminum honeycomb layer in it. And what that does is it allows that cone to prevent from breaking up and create near perfect, there's nothing's ever perfect, but near perfect pistonic motion, which for a dynamic speaker is what you want. You combine that with the crossover, you combine that with the design of the cabinet to have less diffraction, and you wind up with this sort of svelte-shaped Magico M9, and then we go to the listening room, and we get to hear what those three categories, if you will, of technology mean. Now, I should also add that I'm not fully describing the experience of going to the factory. There are CNC machines that are using ultra-precision machining to build the aluminum cabinets and all the aluminum baffles. They use a special material that's like a blue thing that's sort of a squishy sheet that absorbs vibration on the front of the speaker. But they're pretty state-of-the-art in terms of measurements, and they're using the German-based Klippel loudspeaker measurement system that takes a microphone and goes 360 degrees around the loudspeaker and measures it, and they can refine their designs in a really precise, state-of-the-art fashion. And I think that's a secret ingredient, so I shouldn't have left that out. But if we go to the listening room, Alon had some demo tracks. He was willing to play me anything, which was great, but he had some demo tracks. I said, okay, I'm along for the ride this far. Let's see what these things can do. And I was a little surprised. They're actually bi-amp speakers. So they're actually there were four monoblock Pilium amplifiers chunky blocks. I'm not as familiar with them. And their source was, we were playing files, I believe. I might have been an Inuus server or an render. I think it was Inuus. But we were playing on an MSB Select 2 DAC. And I have to tell you, I have a friend with a Select 2. It's a magnificent piece of equipment. Despite my love of DCS, MSB creates really wonderful sound too. So we were obviously listening to quite an expensive rack of equipment in between the speakers, playing back the source files. The first thing that Alone played for me was a percussion piece, kind of a jazz piece, but what it was Marilyn Mazur and Jan Garbarek playing a track called Pathway, which had very low bass notes, but it had sort of floating percussion instruments in between the speakers. I have to tell you, I've never heard such lifelike percussion in my life, and the bass of the M9s on this track was kind of subtle. I thought, well, shouldn't there be more bass? But the thing about high-quality bass is it's often subtle. If you're hearing too much of it, you've moved into hip-hop land, and you're getting an exaggerated bass, and you don't really want to do, well, you might want to do that if you listen to Outkast and groups like that. But what you're finding is you're hearing that kind of bass permeate the room. And it was sort of like an atmospheric bass. It's a little hard to describe on camera. But that track was magnificent. I thought, okay, I know one thing now from this first track. We're hearing correct timbre, we're hearing percussion that's lifelike, and the soundstage was vastly wide and vastly deep front to back. And so I was already impressed with that. Then we went to Into the Labyrinth track. I believe it was Dead Can Dance. I believe it was Into the Labyrinth. Might have been Yulunga, which is a common audiophile demo. But the bass on that is... Alone reminded me in an email, but I literally did tell him this was probably the best bass I've ever heard from a speaker. It wasn't overpowering, but it was visceral. It was real. It sounded like, you know, a great bass instrument. It was magnificent. And it might have been electronically produced, but it was just magnificent how that bass sort of propagated throughout the room, if you will. But I think at that point I'm very impressed with the speaker, but I'm not thinking this is life-changing stuff. So then Alone put on a choral track that just blew my socks off. And it was from a group called Voces 8, V-O-C-E-S, and it was called Ubi Carita. And it's on an album they did, and there is a high-res version, which I've listened to off and on since then. And this thing has a very lifelike presentation. It's a choral work, and the voices are lifelike. I have found that as you move up the line and move into the more reference systems, the individual choral members can be picked out, and it sounds like a group. It doesn't sound like everything's mashed together in one sort of unified voice. You can hear the individual voices, though, coming together to create that choral sound. And that's what I heard on the Magico M9. In fact, the other thing that I realized at this point was that these speakers are not in the room. I mean, they were standing there, and they're 7 feet tall. I'm 6'3", I'm kind of tall. But these speakers remarkably disappeared, at least sonically. And I've heard speakers disappear before, and I've always found that a hallmark of great reference systems, but I've never heard them disappear to where they weren't in the room disappearing. So all this added up on this choral piece to be the most lifelike presentation of music, honestly, I've ever heard. And, you know, it should be. It's a $750,000 speaker. But it wasn't an increment over the M6. It wasn't an increment over the M3, which I've heard a lot at trade shows. It was pretty mind-blowing. It actually changed my thinking. And that's why I started this video with the law of diminishing returns. Because I want to tell a story about these speakers that also leads to better behavior, or at least causes people to challenge my thinking, that the law of diminishing returns, for the most part, based on this, and I know most of us don't have 750 grand lying around to go to Hayward and put an order in for these speakers. If you do, please see Alone. He'd be happy to talk to you about that. But it just keeps going. The more money you spend, the better it gets. Now, there are definitely speakers that are better value for the money than other speakers, so don't misunderstand me there. But let's stop pretending that the law of diminishing returns is a real thing. Let's stop pretending it's something we ever need to focus on. Buy the best thing that you can afford comfortably and enjoy the music. That's all I'm saying today. If you disagree about my take, if you think Lee Scoggins has been drinking too much of the high-end Kool-Aid, that's fine. I've got thick skin. Let me know in the comments. But think about it, reflect on it, and be thoughtful in your replies. Thank you so much. I hope this was useful. If you have an opportunity to get to Hayward and hear these speakers, or go to a trade show in your area or region of the world, it's well worth your time, trust me. I think if they're properly set up, you will absolutely be blown away by the M9s. Thank you for your time, and have a great year.